Good morning. Good to be with you this morning. Welcome our visitors. Always great to have visitors, especially on days that many of the congregations out traveling and either spending time with family on vacation or at work. So certainly pleasant to have you here with us. This morning, I want to look to King David. Title lessons is King David's sin, learning from a king. I want to look at his greatest, well, what many might consider, or what I consider to be his greatest transgression. He made several mistakes, if you will, but probably the one that most people recall, if you think of the sin of David, is his transgression with Bathsheba. And call your attention over there. We'll read over in 2 Samuel chapter 11, and we'll read the first 5 verses. And it says, "It happened in the spring of the year, at a time when kings go out to battle, that David sent Joab and his servants with him and all of Israel, and they destroyed the people of Ammon and besieged Rabbah. But David remained at Jerusalem. Then it happened one evening that David arose from his bed and walked on the roof of the king's house. From the roof he saw a woman bathing, and the woman was very beautiful to behold. So David sent and inquired about the woman, and someone said, 'Is this not Bathsheba, the daughter of Eliam, the wife of Uriah the Hittite?' And then David sent messengers and took her, and she came to him, and he lay with her, for she was cleansed from her impurity, and she returned to her house, and the woman conceived. So she sent and told David and said, 'I am with child.'" So this is the happening of the sin. It's a black chapter in the life of a great man, if you will. 1 Samuel 13 and 14 tells us that David was a man after God's own heart, and that he was a forerunner of the Messiah, yet remembered by many because of this affair that he had. And it's a great lesson, and we can examine and find the some characteristics about sin, and some warning signs, hopefully, that we can use to pick up or to get a better understanding of what sin is. Before we go on, I want to use this as a foundational lesson, if you will. Tonight we're going to look at does a child sin, and we'll look to this account as a case to try to answer that. And so that's why we're looking here at David here this morning. The first characteristic about sin is that I think when we look to this example, or when we do this case study, is that we find that sin is progressive. Sin is progressive. What do we mean by progressive? Well, we mean that one thing led to another with David. Some would say that it began with him being idle. Remember, the author Samuel, he points out that this was a time that kings were usually out with their armies. Kings weren't, from what I read, weren't usually left behind. That they were out commanding their armies, that they were out there being figureheads, probably. That's what we find there in verse happened. It says it happened in the spring, at the time when kings go out to battle. But where was David? He was back. In other words, he wasn't doing what he was supposed to be doing. And then beyond that, he was supposed to be sleeping. It says he was in bed. Then he arose. And he went up on, in other words, he probably got bored, or he couldn't sleep. Whatever the reason, we're not really told, but we can speculate. But the point is, David was never meant to be up on the rooftop. but that's where he found himself. And it was during the time of day that evidently Bathsheba, it doesn't say that she did anything um, that she normally would not have, or that probably the other women of the time did. But nonetheless, she was up there. She was bathing herself of her impurities. In other words, this was probably right after her cycle, if you will, that she had been cleansed, and thus, right during ovulation, when she's probably the most receptive, being pregnant, and but thus led to her becoming with child, which would ultimately lead to what? Another sin that we'll get to here in a minute. But this idleness, if you will, and we can look over to 1 Timothy 5:13 about the warning to widowers to not become idle, being busybody gossipers. There's nothing that comes good from being idle, if you will. That would become bored. The next thing that we see that it progressed is that once he gazed upon her nakedness, he lusted after her. Instead of going, oh no, I shouldn't have seen that, and turning away and fleeing from the situation, he embraces it. He begins to lust after her, to the point that he sends his servants, if you will, over to inquire, well, who is this? Who's this beautiful woman? To the point that they go and invite her to come over. Now, if it wasn't bad enough, that we know from the scriptures that we're not to gaze upon another person's nakedness, and then we certainly know that we're not to lust after somebody. Matter of fact, Matthew chapter 5 verse 28 says, "But I say to you, whoever looks upon a woman to lust for her has already committed adultery with her in his heart." And that's exactly what David did. He desired to be with her. That's why he sent his servants over there to talk to her, to say, and invite her what? Over to see him, to converse. And this led to what? Fornication. It says he lied with her, or that he laid with her, meaning that they went to bed together. And it conceived a child. Now here's another sin, or the evidence of sin, if you will. Now he has to deal with that. I don't know. Her husband's out here. He'll know that she was with somebody else, and then she'll probably confess that, well, it was with David that I had my transgression with. So this leads to treachery. First, go get him and bring him back, and hey, go have a great supper with your wife. Oh no, Lord, I can't do that. That's not the manly thing to do. I should be out in the battlefield. Matter of fact, I'm not even going to really see my wife, because I shouldn't be treated differently from other men. And so Uriah the Hittite wouldn't be with his wife. So then, his cover up, if you will, the scandal, he had to resort to other things now. So what's the first thing that comes to his mind? Well, if he wouldn't come back here and be with his wife, so we could say, hey, look, hey, great, you got your wife pregnant. Well, now I'm going to have to get rid of him, ain't I? Because he's going to put two and two together. He's going to tell everybody else, and eventually it's going to be found out. So what does he do? He sends word to the front lines. Hey, when Uriah goes into battle, you guys go up there with him over. And then as he engages, in other words, he's to lead the charge. And as he engages the battle, withdraw from him. Leave him hanging out there by himself. And of course, what's going to happen with one man against hundreds? Gonna get cut down, right? Problem solved. Oh no, Uriah died. Oh dear, dear. I comfort his wife. Oh, she was such a good one. I'll marry her. Oh look, we can see. It's all taken care of, right? See the progression of sin here. It started out with him doing something that he ought not to be doing. Then he was tempted. He sinned once. Instead of fleeing from it, as we're commanded in the scriptures, he kind of embraces it. That leads to him committing fornication, her adultery. Then he has to cover up the fornication because a child's conceived. That leads to treachery, and ultimately leads to the murder of her husband. One sin begets another sin. Sin is progressive. We see this over and over. Consider, we're not going to read all Matthew 26, but look at some other examples. Peter said, I'll never do that, Lord, I promise you. No, not me, I'm Peter. I would never do that to you. But when we read the account, he what? He got separated from the Lord, and then somebody says, hey, aren't you with him? Oh, no. Never seen the guy before. Nope, not with him. Hey, you sound like him. Aren't you from that region? Nope. Got me confused with somebody else. Nope, never seen him. Even to a third point. Even to the point that he what? That he began to curse and swore. Foul language. Oh no, expletive vernacular, if you will. And then he swears up. He makes a false statement. I swear I've never been with that guy. See the progressive nature? One lie begets another lie. And we see that we probably experienced that as children. Where you been? I was over at Timmy's. No, you weren't. I called Timmy's mom. Oh, well, I was at Tommy's. I forgot. I went to called there too. Couldn't find you there. Oh, well, one lie begets another lie. We're all even told as children that if you just come, it just the snowball effect, if you will. Though we seem to never learn. But this shows the progressive nature of sin. What about persecution? Persecution of the church. First, it began with threats. Don't do that no more. Then it leads to what? Well, you won't be quiet, so we're going to put you in prison. Falsely, blame you for things. And then we're not satisfied there, so we're going to beat you. And then ultimately, what happened? A guy was murdered. He was stoned to death for preaching the gospel. See the progressive nature of sin? We should take this to heart and realize that's the warning to us here. Now with this case study, we can see I don't need to start lying, because if I tell this one lie, I'm going to tell another lie, and when's it going to stop? Eventually, the truth's going to come out. Look at David. David thought, I'll cover this up. No problem. Even to the point that the man had to die to cover it up. Did it still come out? Yes, it did. God knows all. God sent Samuel. And he told him a parable. And in that parable, who's this guy? Who did this? This bad thing. We need to kill him. We need to put him to make him suffer. You are that person. Look at the warnings of apostasy. Still going on today. They were warned, it will not endure. Sound teaching, that is. that they'll eventually heap teachers upon themselves. Look over there at 2 Timothy chapter 4, verse 3. It says, "For the time will come when they will not endure sound doctrine, but according to their own desires, because they have itching ears, they will heap up for themselves teachers." In other words, we'll find somebody who's going to preach the gospel I want to hear. "And they will turn their ears away from the truth and be turned aside to fables." That's exactly what's going. Joel Osteen. Look at just about any TV personality out there that proclaims to be a. That's exactly what they're doing. We was warned 2,000 years ago that this was going to happen. Should be any surprise? But yet it continues on and on and on. What about drifting away? We're warned over and over. Careful lest you fall away. And yet we see how many brethren. Well, I'll miss this one assembly. It'll be all right. I just miss this one. And then I'll miss this next one. Then I'll stop. I promise I'll stop. And then pretty soon we're what? We're no longer attending. Well, it starts out with a Wednesday night. Then it's a Sunday night. Then pretty soon, it's why come at all? We develop a new habit, do we not? We were in the habit of going to church. Now we develop a new habit of not going to church. We start to lose interest in God, and we find interest in what? Other earthly things, entertainment, whatever it might be. Spending time with friends, maybe sleep. Who knows? Only those who do these things know these things. Or they get entangled into other matters. I'm too busy. I got this. I got that. You ever know? I can remember being like that, especially when I first went in the military. It was fun. It was easy to find an excuse. I'm too tired. I gotta wash my clothes. I could find any excuse as to why I couldn't go to church on Sunday morning. And for several years, I just didn't go. Why? I drifted away. So that's the key. One of the key things that we take away here is that, remember, it doesn't stop with one sin. One sin, I guarantee you, will lead to another sin. And if you're trying to convince yourself otherwise, as we often say, we're just lying to ourselves. We're just kidding ourselves. We're not being honest with ourselves. And then that leads me to the next one, is that we often underestimate how sin is so powerful. Yeah, sin is powerful. It overpowered him into lust. David knew not to do these things, but you can almost read in the pages like he couldn't help himself. Why? Because he became overpowered. It was one dumb decision after another. Why would a man who was deemed to be a man after God's own heart, how could he be so foolish to fall for these things? Well, he succumbed to the power of sin. It all starts with desire, does it not? That's what James tells us. Over in James chapter 1, verse 15, it says, "Then when desire has conceived, it gives birth to sin. And sin, when it is full grown, brings forth death." That's the bad thing about lust. You desire to be with somebody. That's the way it is with any sin. Theft. I desired that object, so I took it. Missing church. I desired not to be there, so I missed. Whatever the case may be, I guarantee you, it's always because we don't desire. If we desire the love of God, then what are we going to do? We're going to probably practice the things that we love. But if we desire the things of the world, we're going to do what? We're going to have those things of the world. He should have fled from the beginning. He should have seen the warning signs. You know, you make flashing, nowadays we have red alert, reminds me like when I was watching Star Trek as a kid. Red alert, red alert. It'd be nice if there would be flashing lights that we could see, and maybe probably wouldn't do any good. We just turn them off, right? Just like our alarms in the morning, we hit snooze. I hit snooze probably at least 100 times. Over in 1 Corinthians chapter 6, verse 18, it says, flee sexual immortality. Every sin that a man does is outside the body, but he who commits sexual immorality sins against his own body. Flee from it. Don't go there. But instead, he was drawn in by the power of sin. He couldn't stop. It's like he couldn't stop himself. 2 Timothy 2:22 says, flee also useful lusts, but pursue righteousness. And there's lust, that could be lust of an object, lust of a person, lust of a thing, lust of an activity, whatever that case may be. And then it blinded him until Nathan said, you are the man. It's like, always he was consumed by sin. I got to cover this up. I got to take care of this. Nobody can find out. Blah 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 blah. And he justified one action after another. He could only see his sin in principle. Look there, if you will. Look how Nathan makes this known to him. Then the Lord said to Nathan to God, to David, and he came to him and said, there are two men in one city, one rich and the other poor. The rich man had exceedingly many flocks and herds, but the poor man had nothing except one little ewe lamb, which he had bought and nourished, and it grew up together with him and with his children. It ate of his own food and drank from his own cup and lay in his bosom, and it was like a daughter to him. And a traveler came to the rich man, who refused to take from his own flock and from his own herd to prepare one for the wayfaring man who had come to him. But he took the poor man's land and prepared it for the man who had come to him. So David's anger was greatly aroused against that man, and he said to Nathan, as the Lord lives, the man who has done this shall surely die. And he shall restore fourfold for the lamb, because he did this thing and because he had no pity. And in verse 7, then Nathan said to David, you are the man, thus says the Lord God of Israel. I anointed you king over Israel, and I delivered you from the hand of Saul. Gave him everything that he had. And you repay me how? By committing this grievous sin. Sin overtook him. Sin is powerful. That's why one sin begets another one. That's why sin is also progressive. The next thing I think we can learn from David's account is that sin has consequences. Sin has consequences. Yes, sin is forgivable. That's what we'll look at next. But there's still consequences. The sword shall never depart from your house. That's what was foretold. There in verse 10 it says, now therefore, because you have done this, the sword shall never depart from your house, because you have despised me and have taken the wife of Uriah the Hittite to be your wife. And how true that is. Amon rapes his half daughter, and Absalom revenges that in chapter 13. And then if that wasn't enough, Absalom then commits treason against the king, and the king has to go into hiding. So what God told him came to be true. That was the consequences for the things. In other words, it didn't. Yes, he was forgiven. Like I say, we'll see that in a minute. But there was still consequences for the things that he had done. Then he had to watch his son that he had conceived die. Could you imagine knowing that the son that you just had, an innocent child, says an illness, God caused an illness to come over that child. And while that child was alive, he suffered there with it. He cried and he mourned for that child. That's what we read from the rest of chapter 12. And then, of course, we see her in Psalms. He writes of the agony of his remorse. This was such a grievous thing. He actually penned like a letter to all Israel to say, I have done this. He was confessing his sin. Look at the beginning there, Psalms 51. For I acknowledge my transgressions, and my sin is always before me. It's a constant reminder. I will never forget this. I will never forget the evil that I have done. Against you and you only I have sinned and done this evil in your sight, speaking of God, that you may be found just when you speak and blameless when you judge. So not only are there physical consequences for sin, but there's also that agony, the mental consequences of dealing with that sin. And we probably, maybe not to the magnitude of David, but regret. I'm sure all of us have something that we regretted. If I just wouldn't have done that one thing. If I would have just done this. Granted, we're not to live in the past, but that just shows that, that sin has consequences. And often it's hard to deal with that regret. Granted, this Bible speaks that we're set free from sin because God forgives it. He holds against us no more. But that doesn't mean that you're not going to look in the eyes against the ones that you've sinned against. That there's not going to be a daily reminder of the sins that you've committed, and so forth and so forth. So sin has consequences. And yet, and while yes, sin is forgivable, and that's a wonderful thing, but you're still going to bear the consequences. It's just like, when a person goes out and robs a bank, they can come in and confess it all day long and say, yeah, I've done this. It was a bad thing. But I guarantee you they're still going to go to prison. They're still going to spend time in jail. When David was faced, when Samuel pointed out it, when he gave him the parable and says, you are this man, David did the only thing that he could do. At least he had enough soundness of mind, and I think that this is why he was deemed a man after God's own heart. David confessed and repented of his sins. He didn't justify them. He didn't make excuses for them. He didn't go on committing them. He confessed them, and he cried bitterly. And because he had the right attitude about that sin, because he truly repented, he was forgiven. He wasn't like Saul. Saul wouldn't stop sinning, would he? Saul was told, you're no longer fit to be king. Was that good? Did he listen to Samuel? You know what? You're right. I've done wrong. Here's the crown. Put somebody else in the office that's more fitting than. No, he wouldn't let it go. And then he figured out, well, it's going to be David. So then he tries to kill David. He tries to kill whoever. He became paranoid. And never once did he say, you know what, I have sinned against God and I need to step away from this. No, he had to be killed. He didn't stop until he was put to death. And and he was forgiven. And verse 13 says, and now when David called him, he ate and drank before him, and that he I'm sorry. He was forgiven of his transgressions. However, he had to live with the fact that he killed Uriah, his good friend. That he murdered somebody. That somebody was no longer on this earth because of what he had done. And so, yes, there is forgiveness of sin. And like I say, that's a wonderful thing. That means that we have that avenue into heaven as long as we confess of our sin. That's what 1 John 1:7 through 2:1 tells us. That if we confess our sins, he is sure to forgive us. That's true, but there's still consequences. There's still living with that sin. There's still knowing that you've done wrong. And so, again, it's the whole point that is justification. Just don't begin the process to begin with. Don't fall victim to the progression of sin. Don't fall victim to the power of sin. Don't fall victim to the consequences of sin by just not sinning to begin with. Recognizing the consequences, just don't go there to begin with. I know it's simple in application. Not simple in application. It's simple in principle. It's very hard in application. Look at Solomon. Solomon was deemed to be, the wisest man that there ever was. He was blessed. He was given godly wisdom. Not only he was born with enough wisdom to ask God for wisdom, but God gave him an extra portion, a miraculous amount of wisdom. And even for all of his wisdom, look at the things that he did. He had 300 and some wives? If obviously he was obsessed with women. Weren't supposed to marry women of foreign nations. Exactly what he did. So it has nothing to do how wise one is. It's just reading the warning signs and knowing not to go there to begin with. So that's the lesson. So as we wrap things up, let us, learn to nip it in the bud, per se. just don't go there before it begins to spiral out of control, because that's exactly what it did for David. It was once he committed, once he lusted, it was a spiral downward until he completely crashed. Let us learn that sin can have a powerful hold on to us. Like I said, it's progressive. It gets out of control real easy. It can have a powerful hold. It can cause you to do things that you normally would not do. And realize that even though we may receive forgiveness, because as over in Romans 6, Paul says this is not a license to sin. What should we sin all the more just to prove that there's more grace from God? No, certainly not. Just because we have forgiveness of sin is not a license to go out and commit sin. But there's still punishment to be had with sin, the consequences, the fallout, if you will. And let us learn that sin always requires repentance. Irregardless, unfortunately, one of those powers often that we see, especially in our world today, is an unwillingness to admit that I've done wrong. I was justified. Whatever you want to tell yourself. I've done no wrong. Only a fool says those things. The Bible says all men have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. All have sinned, all continue to sin. So we need the grace of God ever so more than we ever have. But we must repent in order to receive that grace. So that's the lesson. As we close out the lesson this morning, we want to extend the invitation. The invitation is your opportunity. If you're here this morning and are subject to the gospel call, whether to become a Christian for the first time or to call upon the prayers of the congregation, let it be known as we stand and sing the song that has been chosen.